Hello, everyone. Welcome to what I call my writing seminar. Congratulations on taking a little bit of extra time to watch this video because I promise you it's going to help you a lot on your midterm and your final exams in the course, and that in turn will help you a lot on your final grade. Now, just to be clear, what we're going to talk about here in this presentation, I'm going to give you specific advice on my expectations for the midterm and the final essays in the course. Now, hopefully, a lot of what we're going to talk about is just good writing, and so a lot of this will spill over and hopefully improve your papers in other classes as well. But I do this specifically because I don't want you to feel like you don't know what I'm looking for on the midterm or the final. I want you to have the opportunity to have me kind of lay it all on the table and tell you exactly what I'm looking for, so you have a chance to succeed to the best of your ability on the midterm and the final. Okay, so let's talk about what the midterm and the final will be like. I will give you a question, and you will be writing a 3-page response to that question. Now, I will give you on the sheet that has the question some information, and one of the bits of information you'll have is I'll give you some formatting options. You have some choices to make on how you're going to format your paper. You can either do it 1.5 spaced, or you can write it double spaced. And you can either do it 11 or 12 size font. So there are a few choices for you to make. You will generally, depending on which course you're in, you'll have somewhere between 1 to 2 weeks to write this 3-page essay. So you have a good bit of time. 3 pages is not very long, and 1 to 2 weeks is plenty of time. And not only that, but during that week or weeks, you can use any resource you want to try to improve your paper. You can have friends or family members or faculty, including myself, just give advice. You can sit down and talk with people. You can have people read over drafts of your essay. You can call your mom. You can go to the academic support center on campus and have them read over drafts of your essay. All these things will help you immensely and make a much better paper if you make use of these resources. And also feel free to work in groups with other people in the class to talk about ideas you have. The only thing I ask is that you absolutely have to write the paper on your own. But everything you do before the paper and even during the paper getting feedback, I'm perfectly comfortable with you doing all you can to produce a good paper. And you can probably guess from this, I tend to reward people that take the time to do these things. That if you make use of these resources, I have total confidence that every one of you could theoretically get an A. Now, I've never had that happen, so clearly that isn't the way it always works. But if you want to be the person who does get an A, this is probably the best piece of advice I can give you, is make use of your resources during the week or weeks you have your question in your hand. Okay, so I want to give a number of pieces of advice now and a few suggestions for what I would do if I were you to make your paper better. My first piece of advice seems obvious and should be something I should not have to mention, but it is almost inevitably the thing which is the biggest downfall to the majority of my students. And that is, I've given you a question, you need to answer it. And what I mean is, well, let me give you a hypothetical here. So if I were to ask you, if your midterm question, it's not going to be this, sorry, but if I were to ask you, what is the impact of the classical world, ancient Greece and Rome, on the Italian Renaissance? If that's your question, don't in your paper just talk about the classical world and then talk about the Italian Renaissance. The important part of that question is not classical world and Renaissance. The important part is the impact. What is the impact of the classical world on the Italian Renaissance? You need to analyze that impact. You need to, your entire essay through, be focusing on that impact and what it comes from. Now, of course, to do that, you will talk about facets of the classical world and things that occurred in the Italian Renaissance. You'll bring up works of art. You'll probably bring up historical trends or events that have happened. You'll bring up lots of things. But in the end, you can't just talk generally about, here's what I know about the Renaissance and here's what I know about the classical world. You need to focus on the impact. One thing to note is I want you to assume I'm your reader and I am familiar with the details, okay? Meaning you don't need to tell me, if you want to talk about the classical world, you don't need to rehearse every little detail of the classical world that I told you. You can assume I told you this stuff, so I know about it. What I want you to do is I want you to take what I told you. I want you to take the history and the art, and I want you to fuse them together to address this question, okay? So don't just go to your notes and say, okay, today's the day we talked about the Renaissance. And first we talked about this painting, and then we talked about this, then we talked about this, and just rehash that all in your essay. I have absolutely no interest in just seeing that, oh, you listened to me here. What I do have interest in is seeing that you listened and you're able to make some sense and think through an issue in relation to what we talked about in class. So don't just give me historical narratives for the sake of filling me in on the gaps, because I'm aware of them. And then I'm putting this in caps again because it's really important. I don't want you to just describe history or art. I want you to analyze it. A good way to think about it is you've probably seen somewhere on TV or in a movie or something a courtroom scene. I want you to imagine essentially what you're doing here is you are a lawyer. And if you've ever seen like a law drama on TV, you'll know that the lawyers that make the big bucks, the lawyers that get paid a lot of money for what they do, are not the people who are just simply capable of gathering evidence. Gathering evidence is frequently something you assign to like interns and lower level people at the law firm. The guy or girl who makes the big bucks in the law firm is the person who goes before the judge and is able to take that evidence and very effectively use it to make a case for something. Okay? It's not the person who they don't just throw all the evidence in a bag and dump it on the judge's desk and say, here you go, I got lots of good evidence, it's pretty obvious here. You have to have skill in presenting this evidence. You need to make choices of what you want to talk about first, what would follow logically after that. You need to be articulate. All the things a good lawyer would need to do in order to win a case, you need to do in this paper. And that's why at least 2/3 of the paper should be your voice, should be you talking, should be your analysis of the art, of the history, of all those details, all the facts and physical objects and things you'll bring to bear, the evidence you have in your case. But in the end, the evidence isn't what's going to get you the good grade, or in this case, be a great lawyer. It's going to be how you use the evidence and what you say about the evidence. One single piece of evidence could say a million different things. You need to be specific on what the evidence says. So you're a lawyer. Think about that. Okay. Another thing which sometimes, very commonly trips up people, or at least people don't do, is they don't explore the whole field of possible answers to this question. I'm going to give you, and I'll probably say this multiple times in this presentation, a very big question. It will be very complex. There will be a lot of ways of answering it. So I know that you have a tendency, because you've been trained to kind of write research papers where you have an introductory paragraph, then you have 3 body paragraphs, and you have a conclusion. So you want like 3 big ideas for your 3 body paragraphs. And so in your introduction, you'll frequently say, there are 3 major ways that this. Okay, I do not want you to do that. I can absolutely promise you there will not be 3 or 4 answers to this question. There's going to be a lot more than that. The second I see somebody write, there are 3 major ways that X, I think, well, what about this one and this one? Maybe there's 4, maybe there's 5, maybe there's 27, but there's definitely not only 3. So don't say to yourself, I'm going to talk about the 3 most important ways or something like that. I'm interested actually in probably what are the things beyond that? What are the more complex things that not everybody else is seeing? So don't limit your essay, and make sure that you put as many possible ideas into this paper as you can. If you are sitting there either with maybe your mom or maybe with your peers in the class or maybe just by yourself brainstorming, looking through your notes, and you're trying to figure out what is the impact of classical art on the Italian Renaissance, and you see something that seems like, oh, well, that's interesting. Don't say, but that's not as important as this, so I guess I won't write about that one. Don't do that. Get both of them in there. Get as many ideas in this paper as you possibly can, and the more you can get in, the better your grade will be. Okay, another thing you want to do is you want to use your space wisely. I just said this is going to be a big question that has a lot of answers. A good way to know if you're doing it right is if you are having a hard time fitting all of those answers in three measly 1.5 spaced pages. If you're frustrated by that, if you think to yourself, how in the world am I going to get all of this into 3 pages? Good job. You're on the right path. You're doing the assignment in the proper way, and you have a pretty good shot at getting a good grade. If you have written 1.5 or 2 pages and you feel like you have nothing more to say, don't be counting on a good grade because you're probably not going to get it. You need to use these 3 pages and use the space you've got. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. You need to be careful balancing examples with analysis. That, again, 2/3 of your paper should be your voice. And a good exercise to do once you have a rough draft is just to go through and take 2 different colors of highlighters or pens, and every time it's your voice, underline that in one color. Every time you're talking about an example or a work of art or something from history, underline that in a different color, and then look at your paper and see if you've got 2/3 of that in the orange pen or whatever your voice is underlined in. Now, one thing that this is a little bit unique on this paper, in contrast to your standard paper, is I don't want you to have a very long introduction or conclusion. And there's a good reason for this. One is that, well, there's a couple reasons. One is that you only have 3 pages and you have a lot of territory to get to. And I don't want you to waste a lot of space just kind of warming me up to the subject. More importantly, though, is I already know the general subject of your paper. I know what your paper is about, sort of, right? Because I give you the question. Usually in an introduction, what you do is you lay out the stakes of what you're writing about. But because I generally know at least the direction you're going, I know what question you're answering, you don't need a long introduction. So 2 or 3 sentences where you very quickly just get in, and also you can be very generic about it. You can say, there are a myriad of ways in which classical art impacted the Italian Renaissance, many of which I will discuss in this paper, or something like that, where you're kind of generic. I mean, maybe you want to lay out a couple important terms to be a little more specific, but most importantly, don't waste a ton of space on this. I know what you're going to talk about in the paper. Jump in and start talking about it. And the same thing with the conclusion. I just don't want you to, in the 3-page paper, you don't have a half page. If you use a half page for an introduction and a conclusion, you're down to 2 pages. And you can't answer this question effectively in 2 pages. So just don't kill a lot of space with them. And when I say 3 pages, I mean 3 pages. Now, I'm not like a fascist on this. I'm not like, if you're 1 line under 3 pages, you're going to get a grade knocked down. I am kind of fascist more on I don't want it to be any more than 3 pages. If I see a 4th page, I'm just not going to read it. So you can write whatever you want on page 4. I won't be reading it. So your essay might end rather abruptly, which probably won't help your grade. So don't go over 3 pages, but don't go a lot under. You want to show to me you've thought a lot about this question, and one way you can do that is by filling up your space. My last point here is essentially just that. If I see lots of just blank white space on a page when I look at your paper, that is evidence to me that you don't have any more to say on the matter. And that's bad, because I promise there's more to say than what you've said. Now, that I don't want you now to single space it and have 0.3-inch margins just to fill up every space. But you might want to think about using your formatting possibilities I've given you. Just to give you an example here, these are 2 different theoretical first pages of 2 different essays by Drew Brown here, who isn't a real person. This isn't an actual midterm question, but you get the sense, if I get these 2 papers and I see the one on the left, there's a lot of stuff written on that first page, whereas on the right, you can tell they're doing the kind of, let's see, how many things can I list here? Give it a title, a date, where I'm at, and I'm going to return a few times, and I don't even get starting the page till, a third of the way down. And then because on the right, the individual has double spaced it rather than done it 1.5 spaced, they just can't get to as many ideas. So inherently, the paper on the left is going to cover a lot more territory than the paper on the right. So just think about that in the process of how you're going about writing your paper, that the more white empty space I see, I start to wonder why you're not filling that space up. So all you need to do is, like here on the left, write your name. You can write the midterm essay below it if you want, and just jump right in. And again, there's a short introductory paragraph, and then dive into kind of your body paragraphs. Okay, another piece of advice. Another thing that people tend to lose a lot of points on these essays is they don't really consider the structure and the organization of the essay. I think this is something that is getting increasingly hard in the world we live in. You all write a lot. One thing you don't do, though, is write long things very often. You're very comfortable with writing. You're sometimes not very comfortable with writing things that are multiple pages because you usually write emails and text messages and Facebook posts and tweets and all the things you spend your time writing. When you compose a Facebook post, you don't have to think about the organization of the thing. You just say it, right? Uh, but in something like this, it is really important to think through carefully the structure and the organization of your essay and to decide what do I want to talk about first, what should logically follow after that. And so you really need to think through that and don't just haphazardly kind of throw out ideas. You use things like paragraph breaks in a logical way where you're transitioning from one idea to the next. Those things are important. I mentioned this before, but just to reiterate, this is not your standard three-body paragraph paper with a half-page introduction and a half-page conclusion. So don't get that in your head. You can write it that way, but I would highly suggest you think in different terms because it's going to be really hard to cover all the territory in that manner. Now, this is really important, and this is a really good tip, and I'll give you some examples of this in a minute. You want to make sure when you write a paragraph, your paragraphs focus on an idea, okay? An idea that specifically addresses the question. And they don't just talk about a source or a time period or something. Like, one of the things I'll ask you to do in the question is I'll probably say, using evidence from, this article you read and this documentary we watched and class lectures, all these things. I'll tell you some different sources to look for evidence. Sometimes people then have a tendency to say, okay, well, here's my paragraph on this article we read, and then here's my paragraph on this documentary. And what ends up happening is you don't really talk about the question. You just kind of summarize each source. So don't do that. Make sure your paragraphs focus on an idea. And the best way to make sure you're doing this is to make sure that your topic sentences, the first sentence in that paragraph, focuses directly on addressing the question. I should be able to read a topic sentence of your paragraph and know what your answer is to the question, at least in part. Obviously not the whole answer, but the idea you're going to bring up to address the question, it should be right there in that first sentence. Okay, so let me give you an example of this. So here's our question I've sort of been using. In what ways did the art of the classical world impact the Italian Renaissance? Let's imagine that's your question. Now let me throw up a few hypothetical topic sentences in the body paragraphs in the paper. Okay, so first person says, I'm going to begin by talking about ancient Greece. All right, there's multiple issues here. I'm going to talk about using the first person, the I'm, in a minute, which drives me crazy. But independent even of that issue, one of the things that people want to do a lot in these papers is just move chronologically. Because our class moves chronologically, right? We start back in cave paintings and we move to Egypt and Greece and Rome and Christianity and the Renaissance. Like, we move chronologically in class. And so people are sometimes tend to say, okay, well, here's my Greece paragraph and here's my Rome paragraph and here's my Renaissance paragraph. That's not a good way to do it, though, because then what you end up doing is you just end up talking about Greece, and then you talk about Rome, and then you talk about Renaissance, and almost never do you respond to the question, the impact of the classical world on the Italian Renaissance. So if in your first sentence you see a time, a geographical location, I'm talking, this paragraph's about Greece or this paragraph's about cave paintings or whatever, you want to not do that. You want to revise that because you don't want to just talk about a time generally or a work of art generally. You want to talk about an idea. So another example I've sort of been throwing in here. Another first sentence could be a famous classical sculpture is titled The Discus Thrower. And then you talk about the discus thrower. But again, that's not speaking at all to this question. I should be able to read that first sentence and say, oh, that's how it impacted the Italian Renaissance. And in both these, I don't see that at all. Another thing people, again, have a tendency to do, I mentioned this one also, is that if I tell you to use a specific article, so for instance, the article by Larissa Bonfante, you might have a tendency to say, okay, here's my paragraph about that article. And so your first sentence says, in the article by Larissa Bonfante, she talks about nudity in ancient Greece. That is true, she does. But that sentence says nothing by itself in relation to the question that's above. Now, you're absolutely going to want to use stuff from this article. You're probably going to want to talk about the discus thrower. You're definitely going to want to talk about ancient Greece. But you don't want to have your first sentence say that. You want an idea, an answer, a response to the question to start off. So let's look at a good example here. So here is a topic sentence I want you to mirror. One of the ways one of the ways that classical art shaped the Italian Renaissance was through the employment of the nude body. Okay, so all of a sudden, the question was, how did the classical world impact the Italian Renaissance? And that first sentence says it did it because it is the source for the representation of the nude body. That right there is an answer to the question. And if you start off that first sentence on the right foot, you almost always do it well for the rest of the paragraph. You'll keep talking about, nudity and how it began in the classical world and then how it came through in the Renaissance. But if you start off on the wrong foot, if you start by saying, oh, I'm going to talk about this article, or I'm going to talk about Greece now, or I'm going to talk about this work of art, you inevitably will not focus on that. So this is a suggestion of mine. After you have a draft, go through and literally use a pair of scissors and cut out your topic sentences and lay them out in order. And you'll see a couple things. First of all, again, that sentence alone should give an answer, and if it doesn't, it's going to look very odd. Read nothing but those topic sentences and see if your argument makes sense. See if essentially your argument is right there in front of your eyes. And if it is, and if it's in a good order, you can also, if you've cut them out, you can kind of move things around and see, does it make more sense to talk about this first or this first? It's a really good exercise, and if your topic sentences are on point, there's a really good bet you're going to do well on this paper. And this is one of those pieces of writing that I think really does go beyond just this essay. If you write good, focused, concise, to the point topic sentences, you will be a much better writer than if you just throw out a general idea to get your paragraph going. Okay, a couple more pieces of advice. Make sure that you use the right sources for inspiration. I mentioned to you that in the question I will tell you specifically what sources you need to use for sure. And you need to make sure you do it. If I tell you to use something by the article by Larissa Bonfante and you don't, then I have to assume you did not read it. And you will lose a lot of points for that. So if I tell you to use it, make sure you do. Again, don't simply have a paragraph for every source. You want to weave the evidence into your larger argument. But you do want to bring up those sources at some point in time. That being said, I expect that our class lectures will be your absolute greatest source for information. This is where, if you have taken diligent notes, you will be able to use them very effectively and you'll be able to answer the question very thoroughly. So use not only the articles, books, documentaries I tell you to use, but also use your notes. This is where it should pay off if you've taken notes. Okay, I know that for your entire life you've been told by every teacher that ever had you write a paper that you were supposed to revise that paper. And I know that for 99.9% of the time none of you have done that. And probably a large number of you will not do it this time. I'm going to tell you why, though. If you want an A on this paper, you almost have to do this. I give you a good bit of time to write this essay outside class. I don't make you show up in class and spit it out. I give you time, and I want to make sure, I want to see in the essay that you have used that time, that you've thought about this, and that you've used the resources I've given you. And I can promise you that some people will, and if you don't, your paper is going to pale in comparison to theirs. Your writing needs to be in a professional tone. It needs to be articulate. It needs to be grammatically correct. Punctuation, spelling, all these things. If I see spelling errors and punctuation errors and sloppy writing, it is evidence to me that you wrote it the night before. And I don't like that. I want to see that you took more time than that when you hand in this paper. Here's a couple things, a few just kind of red flags, things that drive me crazy when people write to have you avoid. Do not use first-person references in this kind of writing. You aren't breaking any new ground here, which is one of the few times in writing you might be compelled to use a first-person reference. I know it's you talking. I mean, you're writing, your name's at the top of the paper. You don't have to say, I think this. I know that's what you think because it's on the paper that has your name. So instead of saying, I think art in ancient Greece, blah, 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 instead just say, art in ancient Greece, and state what you want to say. Don't hide behind this kind of I. I really hate the we and the you, because then all of a sudden you implicate me as well, so that's even worse. But if you do, and this is where if you have a draft, you can go through and see, oh wait, I use the first person reference here, I need to take that out. Because you might write in the first person your first time around, but if you have a draft, you can then eliminate those. Avoid repeated use of words. If you have a lot of repetition of either words or sentence structure, if all of your sentences are really short or all your sentences are really long, if all of your sentences are structured the same way, if every sentence begins with like he or the or they, and you want to vary that up. You don't want it to be so repetitive. Avoid broad generalizations. I really hate broad generalizations because they are always wrong. And when people tend to do this a little bit more is right at the first of the paper. A lot of times people don't know how to start a paper, and so they say things like, since the beginning of time, whatever, art has been a part of civilization, or something like that, which is wrong, hasn't. So anytime you say since the beginning of time, there's almost nothing you can put after that that is always right in every culture, at every time, in every place. So avoid really broad generalizations, especially at the first of your paper. And then eliminate all dead wood. There's a less nice way to say this that begins with the letters B and S, but essentially, you don't have room for fluff in this paper. You don't have room. It's really easy to spot because, like I said, some people will really take the week or the 2 weeks to write and create something, produce something that's really good. And if you write it the night before and you are throwing out all this fluff, it becomes really apparent and your grade will suffer a lot because of it. So all of us, the first time we write something, we write with fluff. It has stuff in it that we don't need. Where you get it out is when you revise. When you have a draft, you go through it and you take this stuff out. You realize, okay, I'm not saying anything important here. I'm going to take that out and instead make room to say something important in a different paragraph. That happens in the revision process. So if you do this, if you have drafts and go through 1 or 2 or 3 drafts, this is where you'll really start to hone your writing and make sure it's prepared to get a good grade when you hand it in. Okay, final advice. This is going to be a complex question. I want to see that you realize that. If you give me, 3 answers to what is a really complex question that I've seen hundreds of answers to, I'm not going to be impressed. I want you to push a little bit beyond the obvious. I mean, this is why I don't want you to say the 3 most important ways that X happened. You don't want to do that because everybody's going to see those 3. You want to try to push beyond that and think about things in a more complex way. Show me that you see, wow, there actually is a lot to this question when you think about it. And as I mentioned before, what you really want to do is you want to have 5 pages or so in your head that you have to figure out how to fit into 3 pages rather than having 2 pages and then you're trying to fill in gaps to try to get to 3. So if the situation you're in is you have 5 pages, you have to cram it into 3, good job. Figure out how to cram it in. If you've only got 2 pages, go back to the drawing board and think through things again. Sorry for my typos there, the extra 2. Stretch 2, 2, 3, not necessarily. Okay, and then I've said this before, but just to reiterate, use your resources. You have friends, family members, your English major, roommate, and then I think at the top of the list I would put the Academic Support Center is a really good place to help you with writing, and even more at the top of the list, I'm going to put myself here because I'm the one who's literally grading your paper. So I will read through drafts if you want me to. I will do this up until the day before the paper's due. I won't read through drafts the day before it's due because you just don't have time to revise at that point. But if you get me a draft before then, I'll be happy to read it over and try to get you some feedback. And then the kiss of death is you just want to make sure that you hand this in on time. I give you a long time to write it. If you hand it in even 1 minute late, you lose 20% of your grade. And I grade these hard, so when you lose 20%, it's really difficult to, well, pass even this kind of an exam. So if I were you, and I don't, the internet was down, My computer didn't work. All these things I don't take as real legitimate excuses. You have a long time to write this and submit it. You need to get it in on time. There's computer labs on campus. There's different ways to get to the internet. Make backups of your papers, and I would shoot for submitting it. If it's due at, say, midnight on a day or 5 o'clock on a day, shoot for submitting it by noon. And then if you have issues, you have some time to kind of work through them. Don't push it to the end and then hand it in late. Okay, that's what I've got for you. I want to wish you all luck on both your midterm and your final. And if you have other questions you want to ask on this, feel free to either email me or talk to me after class, or contact me in some way, and I'm happy to answer and help as much as I can. All right, take care. Good luck.